Morning, everybody. Go ahead and open up your Bibles to John chapter 11, please. John chapter 11. John chapter 11. We're going to jump right into the scriptures this morning. We're going to be spending all of our time in John chapter 11 and the beginning of chapter 12. So that will be a great spot for you to be this morning here. We're going to jump right into it. And just to give us all an idea of where we are in John's gospel, Jesus has been performing all kinds of miracles, and he has been doing all kinds of teaching that really elicits strong reactions from different groups of people. Some people are really threatened when Jesus heals a man who was born blind and who has been blind his entire life. Some people feel really threatened by that, and other people are drawn to him because of that. Jesus starts teaching about himself and making really bold claims that everybody knew he was equating himself with God. And some people were drawn to him because of that, and other people were picking up the stones to take him out. And so there's a lot of really big reactions to Jesus, his teachings, the works that he's doing in the book of John when we get to John chapter 11. And what I'd like to do this morning is really the second half of John 11 and the first couple of verses of John chapter 12. I'd like to notice those reactions to Jesus. And what I was going to do, I was just going to summarize what happens at the beginning of John chapter 11, but it's just too good to summarize. We've just got to read it together. We're going to read about the account of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. And so as we read this together, we're going to start in John 11, verse 1. As we read this together, I would really like for us to just picture this in your mind. Make it as real as you possibly can and really see what happens here so that when we get to the back half and we see the reactions, we can, kind of pick apart and tease out maybe why those reactions happen and why they're such a big deal. So if you're here in John chapter 11, let's read this account. And if you're just going to listen along or follow along, really try to picture this. John chapter 11, let's read. Verse 1. Now a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was the Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. So the sisters sent word to him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. But when Jesus heard this, he said, This sickness is not to end in death, but for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified by it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was sick, he then stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to the disciples, Let us go to Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and are you going there again? Jesus answered, Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him. This he said, and after that he said to them, Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go, so that I may awaken him out of sleep. The disciples then said to him, Lord, if he's fallen asleep, he'll recover. Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he was speaking of literal sleep. So Jesus then said to them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him. Therefore Thomas, who is called Didymus, said to his fellow disciples, Let us also go, so that we may die with him. So when Jesus came, he found that he had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. Martha, therefore, when she saw that Jesus was coming, went to meet him, but Mary stayed at the house. Martha then said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Even now, I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. Jesus said to her, Your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even if he dies, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? She said to him, Yes, Lord, I have believed that you are the Christ, the Son of God, even he who comes into the world. When she had said this, she went away and called Mary, her sister, saying secretly, The teacher is here and is calling for you. And when she heard it, she got up quickly and was coming to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. Then the Jews who were with her in the house and consoling her, when they saw that Mary got up quickly and went out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Therefore, when Mary came where Jesus was, she saw him and fell at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit, and he was troubled. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus wept. So the Jews were saying, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man also from dying?" So Jesus, again, being deeply moved within, came to the tomb. Now it was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Remove the stone." Martha, the sister of the deceased, said to him, "Lord, by this time there will be a stench, for he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not say to you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they removed the stone. Then Jesus raised his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but because of the people standing around, I said it, so that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come forth." The man who had died came forth, bound hand and foot with wrappings, and his face was wrapped around with a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Do you see why I just wanted to read that this morning instead of summarizing that? It's so powerful. There's so many things that we could talk about in this. Jesus hears that Lazarus is sick to the point of death, and he is deeply moved because he loves Lazarus, he loves Martha, he loves Mary. And instead of coming there right away because he loves them, he stays there 2 days longer. He very well could have gone, but he didn't. He stayed 2 days longer. He finally makes his way down to Bethany, and Martha's like, "If you'd been here, he wouldn't have died." And he says, he's going to live again. He's going to live again. Do you believe this? She said, "Well, of course, in the last day, he's going to be resurrected." But he said, "I am the resurrection and the life." Mary comes. She says the same thing. "God, if you were here," or "Jesus, if you were here, Lord, he would not have died." And so Jesus, we see the amazing compassion of Jesus. Someone who he loved has died. The people he loves are affected by this. Jesus weeps himself. And then Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. A man who had been in the tomb for 4 days, longer than Jesus was in the tomb. Jesus raised this man from the dead. I mean, this is unbelievable. This is unreal. This is stuff that doesn't happen. So then my question is, what do you think your reaction would be to this? Remember, there's a bunch of Jews who were there consoling Martha and Mary who saw this happen. Imagine that you're Martha or Mary. This is your brother that just died. You've gone through all of the things that you go through when you're burying a relative. They know he's dead. He's been in the tomb for 4 days. And then Jesus raises him from the dead. What do you think your reaction would be to that? If you're one of the Jews that came to console and comfort Martha and Mary because their brother has just died and you know he's dead, you see them mourning, and then Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. What do you think your reaction would be to that? Or maybe you aren't even there and you just hear about it secondhand from somebody you trust who was there. What do you think your reaction would be to this? I mean, people know who Jesus is at this point, and now he's raised somebody from the dead. If you're one of his followers who you've heard him claim to be God, you've seen him do many other miracles, and now this guy raises someone from the dead, what do you think your reaction would be? But what I'd like to do is go through the rest of John chapter 11 and go through the first couple of verses of John chapter 12. And together, I want to notice the reactions to Jesus here because they're very different and they're pretty diverse when we notice these reactions. And just to keep us organized and see where we've been, I'm going to put the reactions up on the screen as we read. And then after that, we're going to make some observations and some applications for our lives today. Okay, sound good? Let's jump into this. Let's start here in verse 45, where we left off. Verse 45. Therefore, many of the Jews who came to Mary and saw what he had done believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them the things which Jesus had done. So right away, we see that among those who came to console and comfort Martha and Mary for the loss of their brother, many of them believed in him. What an appropriate reaction, don't you think? You see somebody raise somebody from the dead who you know for a fact is dead. And you see this happen, and they believed in him. That's an incredibly appropriate reaction, I think. They were looking at the evidence in front of them based on what they know and what they've seen, and they decided to believe in him. That's what their reaction was. But right away, we notice a different reaction in verse 46. In verse 46, some of them, instead of seeing this evidence and really thinking through what that means about who Jesus is, they told on him. It's almost like they tattled to their real, true religious leaders, they go to the Pharisees, you got to hear what this Jesus guy's doing. You'll never believe what just happened. And we get a look into their heart here because it doesn't say that they believe at all. And they go to the Pharisees, who we know by this point do not like Jesus at all. They don't like him. They feel threatened by him. They've felt threatened by him for several chapters up to this point. So by them running and telling the Pharisees, we see a glimpse into their hearts. And I don't even know how hard-hearted you can be to see the man who you know is dead, raised and brought to life. And instead of really thinking that through and evaluating what that means, I got to go tell my real religious leaders. I got to go tell them what's going on. And that's what they do. But as we keep reading, there's two reactions, but as we keep reading, we're going to notice some more, especially because these people go and tell the Pharisees. We're going to see the Pharisees' reaction and who they kind of gather together and what they do. So let's keep reading here, verse 47. Verse 47. Therefore, the chief priests and the Pharisees convened a council and were saying, what are we doing? For this man is performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, all men will believe in him. And the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, you know nothing at all, nor do you take into account that it is expedient for you that one man die for the people and that the whole nation not perish. Now, he did not say this on his own initiative, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus was going to die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but in order that he might also gather together into one the children of God who were scattered abroad. So from that day on, they planned together to kill him. Therefore, Jesus no longer continued to walk publicly among the Jews, but went away from there to the country near the wilderness into a city called Ephraim, and there he stayed with the disciples. And so when these Jews who were there to comfort and console Mary and Martha, who saw Lazarus be raised from the dead, when they tattletaled and went to the Pharisees, what we see happen is the Pharisees convene a council with the chief priests and the Sadducees. And this is sort of like in those mobster movies when the five families come together and you know they don't like each other and they're warring with each other, but they find a common enemy. I kind of think this is pretty similar because Pharisees and Sadducees don't get along with each other. They have very different interests. They have very different things that are important to them. However, they unite around the idea that Jesus has got to go. Neither one of these groups like Jesus. They say he has got to go. And so what they do is they plotted against him. They react to Jesus by plotting against him. They are planning to kill him. They're looking for any opportunity that they can do this. But did you notice in verse 47, the end of verse 47, they do acknowledge something about Jesus. The end of verse 47, they say, what are we doing? This man is performing many signs. This man is performing miracles. Even the biggest enemies of Jesus could not deny he is performing signs. And again, how hard-hearted do you have to be? You hear about all these things. You've probably seen some of these things. And instead of thinking it through, what does that mean about Jesus? You're plotting against him. And notice they really show their hand. They really show where their priorities are in verse 48, because they say, if we let him go on like this, all men will believe. Everybody's going to believe in him. And that's the problem, because then the Romans are going to come take away our place and our nation. They were so concerned with their political power, their standing and status on the world stage, that they were completely denying the evidence right before them about who Jesus is. Even the high priest, who we know, historically speaking, this is not a good high priest according to God's laws and the way that he set it up. This is a really corrupt politician. This is a person who should have been the most biblically godly-minded person in all of the nation if there was one. And even the high priest, he's basically saying, well, it's better that we kill one man than the whole nation perish. Let's go ahead and do that. That sounds a lot better than us losing our political power or our status on the world stage. And what's amazing about this is verse 51 and 52, we see that although he's just plotting against Jesus, just like the rest of them, he actually doesn't say it on his own initiative. He actually starts preaching the gospel when he's doing this, because Jesus is one man who will die for the nation and bring all those who are scattered abroad. That's exactly what's going to happen. But to Caiaphas, he's just trying to kill Jesus and get rid of him for his own power and the position of the nation. He doesn't have that intent in his heart. We see that. He didn't speak that on his own initiative, verse 51. And so even the high priest, the one who should have been the most, biblically minded person there was not. They all plotted against him. So from that day forward, verse 53, they planned together to kill him. So there we go. The Pharisees, Sadducees, they're plotting against him. That's what their reaction to Jesus is. But let's look at some more. Let's keep reading. Verse 55. Let's keep reading. Verse 55. Now the Passover of the Jews was near, and many went up to Jerusalem out of the country before the Passover to purify themselves. So they were seeking for Jesus and were saying to one another as they stood in the temple, "What do you think? That he will not come to the feast at all?" Now the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that if anyone knew where he was to report it so that they might seize him. And so right here we see two ways in these verses that people were seeking for Jesus. They sought for Jesus. There was this one group of people that they were, I mean, it seems like they're genuinely interested. They're like, is he going to come up? I mean, is he going to come to the feast at all? Where is he? It says in verse 56, they were seeking for Jesus. Where is he? Is he going to show up? But then at the same time, you see where the chief priests and the Pharisees, they're seeking Jesus too, but it's for the purpose of seizing him and capturing him. And they basically say, if you've got any intel at all, if anybody hears anything, you know anything, let us know because we're going to take him out. We're going to seize him. And so that's what their reaction is. Some people were seeking for him, seemingly for good and positive things, but other people were seeking him for his own harm. But let's keep reading into chapter 12, and we're only going to read the first 11 verses, I think, of this chapter, although we could just keep going and make this go all night, but we won't do that. Here in chapter 12, let's start in verse 1. Jesus, therefore, 6 days before the Passover, came to Bethany, where Lazarus was. Remember that's going to be important. He came to Bethany where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So they made him a supper there, and Martha was serving. But Lazarus was one of those reclining at the table with him. Mary then took a pound of very costly perfume of pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, who was intending to betray him, said, "Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor people?" Now he said this not because he was concerned about the poor, because he was a thief. And as he had the money box, he used to pilfer what was put into it. Therefore Jesus said, "Let her alone, so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For you always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me." And so 6 days before the Passover here, Jesus goes back to Bethany. Remember, Bethany is where Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. So people in Bethany would know who he is, and we're going to see the same players that we saw earlier in chapter 11. They're there. So people in Bethany would know who Jesus is and what he's done. And they prepare a supper for him, a meal, and Jesus is there. Verse 2, we see two reactions right away. Two reactions. Martha served him. Martha was serving, and she was concerning herself with the serving. And we see that Lazarus was dining with him. He dined with him in fellowship. He was eating this meal with him. We know that back in Luke chapter 10, Martha is so caught up in her serving when Jesus is there and Mary's listening to the teaching that she's kind of chastised for it. You know, the Martha, Martha, you are worried about so many things, right? But here in this passage, she's not. She's not condemned for her serving. Martha is a doer. She's a servant. She's someone who she has seen the power of Jesus on full display in her life. She's seen it on her brother, and her reaction is to serve him. And now think about Lazarus. You want to talk about somebody who has experienced the power of Jesus in their life. He was dead for 4 days. Jesus raised him, and now he gets to dine with him in fellowship for this meal. Could you imagine what the conversation would be like? You've got Lazarus and Jesus who are there. Would you want to hear that conversation? So what was it like for 4 days? You know, I'd love to know what that is, but we don't have a record of that. But the thing is, both of these people have seen the power of Jesus on full display. They know what he's capable of. They know what he can do. And their reaction is to serve him and then dine in fellowship with him in this close relationship. But we also see Mary's reaction here during this meal. Mary's reaction as Jesus is sitting down. Mary also, the brother of Lazarus, has witnessed the power of Jesus in her life and on her brother's life. She's seen it. And her reaction here is to anoint him and treasure him. Mary treasured Jesus. And I say it this way because this perfume, this pure nard, was extremely expensive. Judas says that it's worth at least 300 denarii, which is about 11 months daily wages. 11 months daily wages. If you have some days off in there, it's pretty close to 1 year's worth of money. 1 year's worth. That's expensive. And Mary decides to anoint Jesus's feet with something that costs about a year's worth of work. I mean, she values Jesus. Clearly, she's putting it on full display. And Mary, she lets her hair down and is wiping his feet with her hair. For a Jewish woman to even put her hair down in the presence of a man was a big deal. So this is quite the spectacle, what's happening here. It's just so clear that Mary treasures Jesus. She values him. And Jesus in verse 8, it seems like Mary might understand what Jesus says in verse 8, because he says, you will always have the poor with you, but you won't always have me. And it's possible that Mary knows that. And so she's taking this time that she knows she has with him to do something that's really expensive, really costly, and demonstrate that she treasures him. And that's what Mary does. And I love that. I love that. But then also right away, we see another reaction. We see Judas here, and he chastises Mary basically because he says, this is a waste. He knows the value of this perfume, this pure nard. He says, this is worth 300 denarii. You're wasting it on the feet of Jesus. I mean, that's nuts in and of itself, is it not? He says, we could sell that and give the money, give it to the poor. I mean, John tells us his heart. We know that he used to pilfer from the money box. He would steal from it regularly. And he was one who was intending to betray him. In verse 4 says that. So Judas, instead of treasuring Jesus like Mary does here, someone who's been with Jesus for a long time, seen and heard so many things that Jesus does, he says, that's a waste. He steals from him and he betrayed him. That's what Judas's reaction here to Jesus is. He betrayed him, steal from him, and betray him. But then let's read the last couple of verses that we're going to read this morning. We'll notice a few more reactions, and then we'll get to some observations and applications here. So let's start in verse 9. Verse 9. So remember, Jesus is in Bethany. People know what he's done in Bethany, and we're going to see that a crowd of people is going to come. Verse 9. Let's start reading verse 9. The large crowd of the Jews then learned that he was there, and they came, not for Jesus' sake only, but that they might also see Lazarus, whom he raised from the dead. But the chief priests planned to put Lazarus to death also, because on account of him, many of the Jews were going away and were believing in Jesus. Okay, so these large crowds of Jewish people, Bethany's only about 2 miles away. These large crowds of Jewish people who were looking for him. You remember, is he going to come up at all? They hear he's in Bethany and they go to him. They came to him. They came to him where he is, and they want to see Jesus. But they don't just want to see Jesus. They also want to see Lazarus. They had heard that Jesus had raised Lazarus from the dead. And if you want evidence of that, go see Lazarus. If he's alive, that tells you something. They wanted to go see Lazarus. And also, right away, we see that there's a different reaction to Lazarus and going out to see Jesus. There are people who are coming and wanted to see Lazarus for a different reason, because they wanted to discredit Jesus by destroying the evidence. I mean, this is kind of nuts to me. Not only did they already plot and plan to kill Jesus because they disagreed with him and their political power and social status and all that stuff was important to them, but now they want to destroy the evidence. They want to kill Lazarus. They said, verse 11, too many people are believing in Jesus because they can see the evidence in front of them. They can see Lazarus here. So they want to kill him. How hard-hearted do you have to be? And also, it's sort of comical when you think about it this way. Here's a man who died, was dead for 4 days. Jesus raised him from the dead. If you kill him, do you think Jesus could raise him up again? Absolutely, he could. But how hard-hearted do you have to be to just reject all of the evidence and instead try to destroy it because of your own priorities? That's just wild to me. That's nuts. They wanted to discredit Jesus by destroying the evidence instead of examining the evidence for themselves. Okay. So that's all we're going to read today. I know that's a lot, and we have seen at least 10 reactions. I think there's more here, but they just pulled out 10 of these reactions to Jesus after he raises Lazarus from the dead and the things that he's taught about himself. And I'd really like to notice some observations from what we've read. And then at the back end, we'll do some applications, some things that are really practical for us today. The first one, I hope that this is obvious to all of us, is that Jesus is polarizing. Jesus is a very polarizing person. And especially because we've looked at the reactions that people have here in just these, part of 2 chapters, I hope that we see this. Jesus, his miracles, his teachings cause really big reactions in people. It makes them choose a side. It makes people choose a side. And I really think that Jesus is so polarizing because he is so powerful. Remember, the reason for these big reactions is because Jesus made really bold claims about himself. He claimed that he's God. People had really big reactions to that. And then he performs these miracles that even his enemies could not deny. They said in chapter 11 and let's see, verse 47 and 48, remember? If we let him go on like this, everybody's going to believe in him. They couldn't deny what he was doing, but it was against what they wanted. And so they took the side that I would not want to be on. But the reactions to Jesus are so polarizing because Jesus is so powerful. Some people are threatened and run away from him, and other people are amazed and are drawn to him. And we shouldn't be surprised when exactly the same thing happens today, because the people who witnessed all of these things for themselves chose sides. So we shouldn't be surprised when that happens either. And so kind of along those lines, one of the things I want to draw out and make us think about this morning is that miracles aren't enough. Miracles aren't enough. And this is what I mean by this. Not even the biggest of miracles can change hard hearts. Not even the biggest miracles of Jesus raising somebody from the dead who was in the tomb longer than he will be can change somebody who has already closed themselves off to Jesus. And we see that here in this text, the stuff that we've read. Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. There are witnesses, and some of those witnesses didn't believe, ran and told the Pharisees. The Pharisees and Sadducees, they say, he's performing many signs. We can't deny it. But they were closed off already, and they would not accept who he is. Some believed right away, but others go and tattle, and it's just so mind-boggling to me. People legitimately saw it for themselves. They saw Jesus raise a man that they knew was dead. They saw it. And they were so closed off already that would not change them. And I think sometimes I've thought this before where, well, if God would just perform an obvious, unbelievable miracle today, everybody's going to come to him, right? It's like if he would just, I don't know, part these pews like he does the Red Sea, everybody would believe in him. And I don't think that's the case, because we see there were witnesses to Jesus's miracles, but because they were already closed off, they would not believe in who he was. They would not believe. And so in that way, the biggest miracles won't change hearts that are already closed off to God. And along those lines, we see something else in this chapter. It's that belief isn't enough. Belief isn't enough. And this is what I mean by this. We see where these crowds of people believed in Jesus, right? And that's a wonderful, amazing, completely appropriate reaction, right? Absolutely. We see it in John 11 and verse 45, where it says, many of those who came to console Mary and saw what he had done, they believed in him. Wonderful. That's great. In John 12, verse 11, you remember the reason why the chief priest wanted to kill Lazarus is because too many people were believing in Jesus on the account of Lazarus. The thing, though, with these crowds who believed in Jesus is what comes after what we just read this morning. Because on the very next day, from where we stopped, on the very next day, Jesus does his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, and that begins what we call the Passion Week. These crowds of people, the very next day, are going to be shouting and praising and welcoming Jesus in as the king, and they're wanting him to come in, and they're saying, Hosanna, Hosanna. They're putting their clothes down, the palm branches, they're welcoming him in as their king. But in less than 1 week, the same crowds who believed in Jesus are going to be shouting for him to be crucified. Less than 1 week, they'll be doing that. And so I think we see just from that is that just because you believe in Jesus, that does not make you a follower of Jesus. Because remember, in less than 1 week, these people who believe, the crowds, are shouting for him to be crucified. Release the actual murderer and let Jesus die in his place. Less than 1 week. Or even think about Judas here. And I'm not sure if we put Judas in the miracle category or in the belief category here, but here's someone who had seen Jesus perform so many signs, had heard him teach so many things. One of his apostles, and he's stealing from the money box. He betrays him. He sells Jesus for a slave's price. Just because you believe in Jesus, that doesn't make you a follower. So belief isn't enough. Okay, I think those are heavy hitting enough, are they not? But let's try and make some of this really practical and applicational. I don't even know if that's a word, but applicable to us today. And I just got a couple of things for us to consider. And the first thing is that we all need to evaluate the evidence. If you remember the Pharisees and the chief priests and many of those Jews who went to console Mary and Martha, who saw Jesus raise Lazarus from the dead, they closed themselves completely off to Jesus and they refused to look at the evidence in front of them. It wasn't a matter of there is no evidence. It was a matter of refusing to look at the evidence. And we just cannot be like that. All of us individually need to evaluate the evidence for Jesus. And I'm talking about things that are outside the Bible, like things that show that there is a God, that it is the God of the Bible, that the Bible is true and reliable in what it says and portrays about Jesus. And if that's true, then Jesus made some really bold claims about himself. He said some really bold things about what followers of his need to do. All of these things about Jesus, all the things in the scriptures, all of this stuff, we can't be like the Pharisees and Sadducees and just close ourselves off. Because remember, not even the biggest miracle can change us if we are already closed off to him. They even acknowledged what he was doing. They said he's performing many signs. If we let him keep going, everyone's going to believe. But they closed themselves off. We need to open our hearts, open our minds, take a good look at who Jesus is and evaluate the evidence for ourselves. But I think that most of us in the room, we've probably done that. Can I say that? Probably most of us in the room, we're like, all right, I've already looked at the evidence. I already believe in Jesus. So then I think this next one is for us. We need to evaluate our belief. We really need to evaluate our belief. And I say this because just remember, we observed a few minutes ago, these crowds who believed in Jesus in less than 1 week will be shouting for him to be killed, shouting for him to be crucified. They say, let his blood be on us and our children. That's what they say. And so just because you believe in Jesus, that doesn't mean you're a follower. Same for us today. Same for us today. Is your belief simply an intellectual assent that Jesus is a real person, that he was a good teacher? Because if that's it, that's not the Jesus of the Bible. It's true, but that's not the Jesus of the Bible because he is God. He came in human flesh. He claimed to be God. He performed miracles in front of all kinds of witnesses. And this Jesus said he is the only way to eternal life. And no one can come to the Father except through him. He says that those who want to follow after him must repent, be baptized for the forgiveness of their sins, and they must take up their cross daily and follow after me. There's some real costs to being a follower of Jesus. And so we really need to evaluate our belief because belief on its own isn't enough. That's really just the beginning, right? That's just the beginning. So we need to evaluate our belief. Okay. And so lastly this morning, I think this is probably where all of this has been leading us as we've looked at people's reactions to Jesus in this text. And that's this. We've got to evaluate our own reactions. What's your reaction to Jesus? Take that however you want. What's your reaction to Jesus? What has it been in the past? Has it been like the Pharisees and the Sadducees where you are already so closed off to the idea of Jesus that no amount of evidence is enough to change you? Have you believed in the past only to continue your lifestyle the way that you want without enduring and taking on the costs of being a follower of Jesus? Have you had a reaction that caused a special relationship with him? I mean, just think about this. Those in this text that we've read this morning who had a special relationship with him, they shared some really interesting things with him. Do you treasure him like Mary? Do you treasure him like Mary? Do you serve him like Martha? Do you dine with him in fellowship like Lazarus? What's your reaction to Jesus been? What will your reaction be to Jesus this week? Right at the beginning of the week. What's it going to be this week? Will Jesus have any effect on your life Monday through maybe Wednesday? And then what about Thursday through Saturday? Will Jesus have an effect on your daily life? Jesus made bold claims about himself and about the people who are going to follow after him. And then lastly, what about today? What's your reaction to Jesus going to be today? I mean, we've just looked at some stuff that Jesus did here. We've seen other people's reactions, but what is your reaction to Jesus going to be today? And so if you don't know much about Jesus and you'd like to learn more about him, we would love to study with you. We would love to look at the evidence with you with open hearts and open minds. We'd absolutely love to do that. But if you've studied and you believe that Jesus is the Son of God and you want to be immersed for the forgiveness of your sins, become a follower, an active, everyday follower of Jesus, we got water right here. We're happy to do it. We'll do it today. We're more than happy to do it. Or maybe you have become a Christian in the past, but you haven't been living every day for him as Jesus would have you to do. Whatever your spiritual need might be, there's an opportunity to make your life right with God. Just come up to the front while together we stand and while we sing.